Hey, what's good everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at creative snare design. I'm going to be teaching this in 3 parts. The first part is going to be synthesis of a snare, just like completely from scratch. The second part is going to be distortion and processing effects. And then the last part is going to be some variations of how to kind of shape it in a creative way. Now, these initially, for the most part, this is actually something that I picked up from DMTR, and the last kind of finishing touches are something that I've been experimenting with, but we have a podcast with DMTR that you can go and watch his take on this from Ableton if you're watching as an Ableton user. FL gang, I don't know what to tell you guys, I'm sorry. If this is the first time coming to the channel, just know that I would always appreciate a like, follow, subscription, comment, all that stuff. And if you have any questions regarding this stuff, I'm always available, and all that stuff. I have some free and paid things over on the website that you can check out, these kinds of drums included, but I wanted to document this information to kind of just have it out there. So in regards to making snares and drums in general, the main thing that we want to think about are the ingredients to it. And for the most part, as far as like a snare goes, we have a sine wave, and then we have some kind of noise on top of it that has a transient. And that's kind of like how we associate with just the smack in its own right. So with Kick 2, I think that it's a great visualization. Again, you can do this in Faceplant or Serum or whatever synth that you have, but for this, we can kind of see what we're doing with the pinch envelope, and that's going to be like your main proponent of creating the fundamental. So what I mean by that is right here, we're looking at a pitch envelope of A sharp kind of octaves that go all the way down to F sharp 3. And that sounds like this. Let me turn off the noise generators on here. And really, like, this is the main component of this. Now, the reason why Kick 2 is great is because we can kind of freely form this, I guess, multi-stage envelope into shaping the, I guess, tone of the snare. So the thing that we want to be mindful of whenever you're creating a pitch envelope in any synth that you're using is that this needs to fall into a higher register of the frequency range, because if you have something that's here and you kind of like span this out in such a way, then this is going to become more of a kick. So really, like, this is like the big proponent of getting this right in order to make it kind of sound like the snare that you want it to. So I'm going to back up a little bit, and we're going to start from A sharp 7 and kind of fall into kind of like this lower region here. And that is kind of like the first thing that you want to go for. I'm going to take that back to here. Once you have that, then we need to think about the top layer, which over here we have some noise generators, and that's just going to help give it a little bit more of the smack part. Now with this, on the click quote-unquote generators, you can actually use any sample. You can actually like drag a sample into here and create some cool stuff, but there's plenty of kind of like factory things that you can use just to layer on top of that. And really, like, there's so many different ways to grab noise. Just get noise and, kind of mess with the length and the pitch and kind of just layer that on top of each other. There's not really a whole lot more to explain with that. You can also kind of like mess with the mix and the loudness of it, but again, I wouldn't worry too much, because the more that we have from the noise in the first place, the better that we're going to be able to push a transient into it, if that makes sense. So I'm not using the click 3. The click 2 is just kind of an extra smaller layer, but over here we have our sine generator, and this is the fundamental of the actual sine wave. I tried to get as close, or sorry, I try to like push as many harmonics into a sine as I can without it actually sounding like something other than a sine, but I encourage you guys to kind of explore. So if you have access to an FM synth, then you can kind of do that stuff. This is kind of what that is, but right now this is relatively close to just a regular sine. So over here we're going to go into our EQ, and this is a typical kind of like EQ practice for any kind of snare where we're cutting everything below the fundamental. We're boosting around 1K, dipping around 3K, and then doing a little bit of a high shelf. And I think the biggest thing is that we're just pushing the fundamental up just a little bit. From here, we go into our distortion tab, and this isn't anything special. It's really hardly doing anything noticeable at all, but it's just kind of on that setting. But for the initial thing, we're kind of just trying to design just a nice kind of like smacky thing that we can use to manipulate further. Finally, this is actually doing quite a bit. If I turn this off, this is helping bring out some of that high ends, but whenever you do compression on drums, you generally want a long attack, long release, and then a high ratio and kind of like I guess, mess with the threshold, so to speak. Just as far as like a quick crash course on like what to do with the compressor in the means of drums. As long as you have a high attack and long release, then you'll end up getting a much punchier kind of transient. So yeah, this can be done, like I said, in just about any synth, and it doesn't take a whole lot of processing, but it's kind of cool because it's all like everything you need is kind of already there, and that kind of summarizes things for stage 1. Stage 2 is kind of where we do some creative processing and really try to beef this up, and I'll kind of go through these one by one. The first thing that we're going to use is a means of distortion, so I've just added a little bit of saturation here. Oh, I turned that off. So really the only thing that I did was turn this down and then turn the drive up and make sure that this is kind of just at normalized. And honestly, like that snare on its own is probably already usable. If you guys have seen the kick video that I made not too long ago, then this will be a similar process. But one of the big things that we have that we can play with snares is using some kind of reverb or convolution. And in this case, I've used Trash 2. So if we take a listen to this, there's a lot of stereo information that's been added from the convolution reverb. We want to be careful because we want to keep it at a relatively low mix, but having this kind of be subtle will add a little bit of wideness to our snare if we want it to. And you can use reverb, you can use a different convolution reverb or just regular hall reverb in general. But if you do, then you might want to split this into a separate chain and mix it in individually. But for this, I find that it's okay. It's not that big of a deal. All right, so the magic DMTR processing is going into a frequency shifter and kind of doing an arbitrary number. With snares, you can kind of get away with it at like a wider range of frequencies because we're manipulating white noise. So like there's always something to bite onto. But basically what I've done here is kind of taken everything out above the fundamental. So our fundamental is showing that it's here and forced a new fundamental with an EQ. Over here, I'm just kind of dipping out that low mid, or sorry, kind of mid region of like 3K. But now we're starting to get almost like a completely different sounding snare. And you can like pick any fundamental you want, just boost the heck out of it. I'm refortifying this here with the same fundamental and kind of bringing some of that back. But as you can tell, now it almost sounds like a completely different snare. So if we look at this to this, it's kind of like transforming it in a very, very dramatic way. So once we have something to bite onto from pushing those EQs up, then we can use a transient control to fortify that transient in general. And I'm pushing the attack up and pushing the sustain down a little bit, but that's tightening up the drum in general. The last thing that we have is a glue compressor, and that's just doing super heavy compression. And that's kind of tightening everything up to kind of help fortify all this wonky processing chains that we do. So, I mean, literally from here, or even here maybe, you can already have a usable snare. In fact, you don't even have to do that processing. You can just use the kick too and maybe use like some extra compression or something. But through this kind of processing stuff, there's some creative approaches that you can do, which is why I wanted to show this and document it in my own words, so that way we can kind of look back on this and be like, oh, well, what was I doing back then? Now, the next two processes that we have are optional, and I'm going to go over both of them, but it's kind of just a means of like figuring out different ways to make your snare sound cool or fit within the context of the genre of your track, because there's different mixing philosophies per genre. Yeah. So the first one that I wanted to show, and I want you to pay attention to the oscilloscope whenever we use this, is the upwards compression method. And the way that this works is you take the low band of the fundamental of your snare and you add expansion to it. So you pull the threshold down and then expand it. Likewise, you can also do regular compression, but really we're just kind of manipulating the low band here. But watch what happens to the initial transient here. You see how it starts kind of smaller and then gets louder over time? That's one creative approach that you can do. And of course, if you do this, it's going to make the snare a lot more quiet. So you can use a limiter to kind of bring that back up a little bit. So the advantage of this, again, is kind of like just taming the transient in such a way that is still kind of like smacky, but not too in your face. And you'll see that a lot of artists, especially like in IDM and stuff, have like transient shaping kind of like this within their snares and kicks. So the next thing that we have is kind of like the quote unquote disprove method. If we look at this, this is one from his splice sample pack. You'll notice that the smack of the transient here is super thick. And so basically, in order to achieve that, what we do is we grab a soft clipper here and we turn the clip down by quite a large region, and watch what happens when you have before. So here's our initial transient here, and then when we turn the clip on, we've kind of smoothed everything out. But because we've turned the volume down by quite a bit, the way that we fix that would be using, again, a limiter or something to gain or introduce more gain, and then suddenly we have like a really hard smack, as you can see here, nice and thick and chunky. So that's pretty much a review of how to do some creative approaches to making snares. And again, I'm not claiming for this to be right, it's just some creative approaches that you can use to make your drums get really loud. Drums are one of the most important things in my music, and I really try to be meticulous with how I not only design them, but how I make them kind of stand out and be different than other artists in particular. But yeah, I'm curious, if you guys have some drum processing techniques or kind of things that you want to share, leave them in the comments, or if you guys have any questions, that's always available as well. But hopefully this was informative and interesting to you. But yeah, man, go make some snares. And yeah, let me know if you guys want to see this redone in like Faceplant or Serum or something too. I can do that as well. That's pretty much it for you guys. Thanks so much for watching my content, and I will see you in the next video.